This conference
Hey
will
all, good
now be
morning.
recorded.
Hello all, good morning.
Naveen.
Morning,
Good
sir.
morning, Naveen.
We are almost 20 minutes late.
Yep.
Okay, no worries. Okay, so we are discussing Spring Core and we understand about IOC containers and dependency injection with multiple types, setter and constructor, and we understand various types of dependencies like simple primitives, arrays, collections, and secondary types we injected, and we know how to manage life cycles like init and destroy methods. We can manage it. And coming to auto wiring and stereotypes also we discussed. Once again, I'll go through these topics. Stereotypes. Okay. So before these topics, okay, there is a topic name called dependency check. Dependency check or at the rate required. Okay, there are two annotations. Okay, one annotation is dependency check is a XML based configuration and the annotation is required. Okay, we'll talk about this dependency check today. Okay, so dependency check, what is dependency check and what is this required? And there is one more property name called depends on. Depends on. Okay, dependency check required, dependency on. We'll go one by one. Okay, let us start with this dependency on, then we will discuss about dependency check and required. Depends on. When somebody is having dependency on others, like while we are growing up, we might have dependency on our parents, right? Without parents, we can't grow up, right? So here the dependency for the child is parent. Parent is a dependency. As a child, as a kid will depend on his parents. There is a child, this child will depend on his parents. Child depends on his parents. Without parent, without mother and father, there is no child. So he is depending on both mother and father. Depends on, he is depending on. Depends on mother and father. Who is having this dependency? Child is having. From child side, child is having both these dependencies. With mother and without father, there is no child. Consider there is a car. There is a car. There is a car. And car is depending on engine and fuel. Engine is depending on fuel. Here, kind of hierarchical dependency. Car is having dependency of engine. Without engine, no car. So without engine, there is no car. So car is having dependency of engine. Car is having dependency of engine, and a dependency needs this dependency engine needs fuel. Without fuel, there is no engine. So here the dependency is kind of hierarchical dependency. One is depending on another. Car is depending on, depends on engine. Engine is depending on fuel. So when something is mandatory, right? When something is mandatory and when something is dependency. While you are doing these configurations in XML based, right? In XML based configurations, if you have one dependency in another, okay? So while doing configuration in car, if you configure that, while doing car configuration, right? Car bean configuration. If you configure that car is depending on engine and engine is depending on fuel, then what will happen? Spring will start initializing the first foremost dependency in this hierarchy. Okay, here if you see this child, if it having the multiple dependency, like child is depending mother and as well as father both. So based on the availability or based on the configuration, first mother or father will be initialized based on the order. But when it comes to this hierarchical dependency, car is depending on engine, so car will wait for the engine initialization. So when it comes to the engine, engine still is having dependency of fuel. So engine will wait for the fuel initialization. So first the fuel object need to be created, then that fuel object creation after IOC will create engine. So once engine object creation, car engine will create. So when you have these dependencies, and if you want to start dependencies first, why we need to start dependencies first? Because I have some logic here. I have some that logic here. That logic need to be initialized first before my other object initialization. So I want to initialize compulsory fuel first. Otherwise, I can't start the engine. So this is some kind of configuration that need to be started first before the engine. So you need to configure depends on. So in engine class, if you configure depends on fuel, then fuel will be initialized first. The same way, car needs a engine. So when car needs an engine, in car configuration, if you configure depends on engine, then engine will be initialized first. Okay. So this depends on will help us to initialize dependency objects first. The depends on will helps us to initialize dependency classes first. Instead of child object creating first, mother object and father object will be created when you configure child with depends on mother and father. The same way, when you configure car depends on engine, engine will create first. If engine is having another dependency, that dependency will create it first, then next it will create, then third it will create. So in initialization, object fuel will be created first and engine will be second. The second initialization will be engine, and in third place car will be initialized because each is having dependency on other. So a simple thing in XML, right? While configuring your car engine bean ID, we configure car class here. Let's say if we have a car beans car, and this car initialization will be happened once after. If you want to initialize this car once after engine class object creation only, you need to pass depends hyphen on. There is a property depends hyphen on. Here you need to pass the engine class reference. So whatever ID you use for engine class, right, you need to pass that reference here. So that what will happen, whatever bean is there with this engine ID E, right, that bean will be created first. Engine, and engine is having dependency of fuel. So fuel is not having any dependency. So now in this scenario, what will happen? First, engine object, okay, first car object will try to create container. When it try to create car object, what will happen? Car is having dependency of engine. So it will come here and check whether it can able to create engine object or not. If it find engine object also with another dependency, then it will go there and it will create first this one. So here the first object will be initialized, fuel object, then next engine object, then finally car object will be created because car is having dependency of engine, and engine dependency we have, engine is having dependency of fuel. So the dependencies will be created first when you configure this depends on. Otherwise, we can't predict the order. In any order, the objects can be initialized. In any object, the object can be initialized. We'll see a simple example here. Okay. Dependency injection using depends on. So add libraries to class path and let me create classes here. A car class and a engine class and a fuel class. Just put a statement in constructor just to check which object creating first. Fuel object. Yeah, just configure these three classes: car, engine, fuel in Spring XML file. We know how to instantiate them, right? So just configure them in Spring XML file. Car object, create engine object, beans dot engine, beans dot fuel. I don't have any dependencies there. Okay, simply I have car class, engine class, and fuel class. Now there is no depends on added here. If you try to run it, order can be anything because each is not depending on each other. One is not depending on each other, so you can start it in any order. Initialization can happen from the IOC container in any order. Okay, so we are trying to loading it to our IOC container, and when we start it, car, engine, fuel created. If we change the order here in XML, if we change the order and if we try to load it, so in order we have engine first, then fuel, then car we have. So based on the order, it is creating it. Based on the order which you configured here, it is creating it. But in general, as I said, right, first repository objects we create, then service objects. If you consider fuel as a repository, DAO class, right, this need to be created first, and this should be next, and finally this the controller should be. Okay, so if you consider this as a repository and this as a business and this one as a controller, so in this order it should initialize. But if you miss this order, okay, if you configure fuel lost and engine here and car here, there is no order following here. As a developer, you are not following order, but for object creation there is a order must be required for you if you have such requirements, right? So I want to create fuel first, then next engine, then car. So when you have such dependencies, right, what you need to do is you need to add depends on. When you add depends on, you need to pass on which object you have dependency. Engine. Car is having dependency of engine. And again, depends on. Depends on. Engine is depending on fuel. So now I have dependency on each other. Car must be initialized after engine, and engine must be initialized after fuel. So fuel will created first, then engine will be created, then car will be created. Now see, fuel object creating first, though it is a in configuration, if it is last also, first object creating, then whatever configured first, the engine class object creating next, finally car object is created. Right? When you have multiple classes, for your application, and if you want to predict the order, or if you want to consider the order of initialization, you can use this depends on. So when you use depends on, so when car is having dependency of engine, you need to configure depends on engine here. So car initialization will be happened after engine, and for engine when you configure depends on fuel, engine initialization will be happened after fuel only. So in order, fuel will be created first, the next engine, and the next car. Okay, so this is how you can use depends on if it is a XML based, configuration. In annotations, we are not worrying really about it. Okay, yeah. So this is what dependency depends on, and there is a dependency check. Okay, this is dependency on. So just dependency on is to make the dependency object creation first before creating the its associated. Okay, now dependency check, we have dependency check. We have dependency check concept. This dependency check is for checking the dependency. Depends on is to mention the on which object we have the dependency. On which object we have the dependency, to mention that dependency on is useful. Otherwise, if you forget to configure engine, right, car initialization will not be happen. It will ask where is the engine object. As we are configuring depends on. So in depends on, you need to pass an ID. So then must be you create a engine class object. Then engine needs a fuel. So you must need to create a fuel object. So in the given order, the dependency will create first. Fuel is the fuel is not having any dependency, but it is the dependency object for engine. So it will create first, the next engine, the next car. So when you use dependency check is useful for dependency injection. Here depends on is for creation of objects. Depends on topic is helping us to create the objects in an order. Create objects in a order of dependency chain. Based on the dependency order, in that same chain, it is creating the objects based on the dependency chain. Whereas dependency check is useful. Dependency check is useful to verify dependency injection happened successfully or not. To verify your dependency injection. What is verifying dependency injection here? Considered as we have the same bean classes, I have a car class here and a engine class and fuel class here. In fuel class, I have one dependency parameter, private string fuel name I have here. And a setter method I have here to inject the fuel name. Fuel name is mandatory for my fuel class. Fuel name is mandatory for my fuel class. It is mandatory also. If you don't put any such conditions here, your application will start as usual. If it is mandatory also, your application will start. objects are creating. So if something is mandatory for your class, if you consider this as a DAO, always I'm saying this as a DAO, right? If it is a DAO, consider you are passing driver class name, URL, username, passwords to connect with data. So driver class name, URL, username, password. If you see that 4 parameters, driver URL, username, password, right, and driver class, is there any optional parameter out of these 4 properties if it is a DAO class? No, compulsory you need to pass all these properties to create a connection object. Driver is mandatory, URL is mandatory, username, password. Everything is mandatory. Still, if it is mandatory also, Spring is not forcing us because it doesn't know whether your bean object or your DO object required that 4 properties or not. Spring doesn't know about it. So how we can configure that something is mandatory in our class? How to say that something is mandatory in our class, so that if I miss that configurations here, Spring will throw an error that you are missing some mandatory configurations. Okay, so there are some mandatory configurations your Spring should force us to pass all the mandatory parameters to your class. As I said, a simple DO class, if you consider here, a simple DO class you have, right? A DO class with the driver, URL, username, and password. So these 4 properties are mandatory, and I have 4 setter methods also here. In my DO class, I have 4 setter methods also here. The 4 setters I have here for injecting this driver, URL, username, and password. I have setter methods also. Consider if it is something student DO. For doing CRUD operations, here I have save method. In this DO class, I have a save method, update method, delete method. I have multiple operations method. So to execute the save, update, delete method, I need a connection. That connection I can able to create using only these 4 properties. Without these properties, I can't able to create the connection. So these 4 properties are mandatory properties. How I can configure? They are mandatory, right? So this way you can say in your bean configuration, right? While you are configuring your student DAO class name equal to, we configure our bean class here. Let's say if it is in DO package, DO dot student DAO. Basically, it will not throw any exception until unless you configure dependency check. If you don't configure dependency check, then no issue. It will create the DO object. If you directly try to utilize this DO object to save the student data, if you try to use this DO object, then as because the driver URL, username, passwords are not injected, there is no connection. If there is no connection, we cannot create any statement and we cannot able to execute any SQL query. So these parameters are mandatory. When you have properties as mandatory, you can configure here dependency check. You can configure here dependency check. In this dependency check, what you can say is you have primitive properties. All the driver URL username are simple string types, right? We need to pass driver class name as a string, URL also as a string, username, password also as a string we need to pass. When your dependencies are simple strings, what you need to do, you need to configure dependency check is equal to simple. You need to configure dependency check simple. Simple means all simple properties mandatorily you should inject. Simple properties are primitive properties. If you have something integer or string properties, if you have something like that here, all that properties compulsory you should inject all the simple properties. Simple properties in the sense all the primitives. Simple in its meaning is all the primitives. All the primitives compulsory you should inject. If you don't inject, then this object also will not create. So what we'll say, while object creation, it will check all your dependencies also. As I said earlier, setter dependency injection is not mandatory really. Spring will not force us to pass all the properties if it is a setter dependency injection. Until unless it is a constructor dependency injection, if it is a parameterized constructor, without calling your parameterized constructor, you cannot able to create object. So that's a basic thumb rule in Java. Without passing properties into parameterized constructor, we can't anyway create it. But when it comes to the setter methods, your object will be created first. Thereafter, setters calling is your option. But when you have really mandatory setters, then what you should say is you need to say dependency check here. When you put a dependency check here, then compulsory you need to inject all the properties. Which properties? All the simple properties. Okay. The same thing without this property also you can check. The same thing without this dependency check property also you can do that by using annotation name called required. On top of your setter method, what you need to put is @required. You need to put @required. If you put required also, that would be enough. Either using required or by using this dependency check, you need to mention. When it is primitives, simple you are using it here. If your class is having another class dependency, then you need to put instead of simple object you need to put. Instead of simple you need to put object. Object means all secondary types. If you have any secondary types in your class, secondary dependencies, consider car is having dependency of engine is having dependency of fuel. If you have such other class dependencies, you need to use dependency check object, which means all secondary types, all Java objects, other objects. Okay, all Java objects. So other Java objects, when you have dependency, you need to put dependency check to object. If you want to make both all primitives and all other Java objects all as mandatory, you need to use all. Simple, object, all. We have three options. When you use simple, all primitives dependency injection mandatory. When you use object, all associated Java objects as mandatory. When you use all, both primitives and objects are mandatory. Okay, so that is what a dependency check is. So consider here you have fuel class. Fuel class is having a fuel name and I want to make it very mandatory parameter. Since you didn't configure any dependency check here, your application is able to creating object and you could able to use it. But it's not fully configured. You will see some exception during runtime as mandatory parameters like driver URL, username, passwords not given. Your application is starting. Still, if you want to configure, as you have mandatory property field name here, you want to configure that field name as a mandatory. You need to do what? Dependency check. You need to put dependency check to simple. That's it. I didn't do anything, just dependency check to simple. I configured it. Now run it. Dependency check to simple. I configured it. Run this. See, something is happening here. Fuel object created. Thereafter, I'm getting exception. Application is terminating. Your car object and engine objects not created. And it is saying one exception here, unsatisfied dependency exception. Container is not satisfied. Why? Error creating bean name with fuel. Okay. While creating fuel object, it is getting exception. Unsatisfied dependency expressed through property fuel name. It is saying fuel name is unsatisfied. Set this property value. You please set this property value. What it is saying is container. Set this property value or disable dependency checking. What it is saying is if it needs, pass this value or else remove the dependency checking. You are doing dependency checking here and you are not passing it. That's why I'm not able to proceed ahead. So what you need to do then, mandatorily you need to pass your property. What is the property name we have in here in the fuel? Fuel name is the property. So you need to pass fuel name here. You need to pass fuel name here. And the value of the fuel can be anything that as your wish. Petrol. Now try to run this application. as dependency check is satisfied. Now it is creating objects. Fuel object, engine object, car object created, fine. Same way in engine class, I'll put the dependency of fuel. Fuel is a object, right? Engine class, I'm putting a fuel as a dependency. Set fuel. Engine class is having Java object as a dependency. Another Java object as a dependency. Now for engine class, I want to put a condition here. Dependency check. So what I need to use here? When your class is having primitives, you need to use simple. When your class is having secondary type, sorry, this is for engine, right? When your class is having secondary types, engine class is having fuel class object as a dependency. So when you have another class object as a dependency, what you need to do here? Dependency check, you need to use object. Now what will happen? When I run this, again same exception, unsatisfied dependency, engine object created, thereafter it is terminating. Error creating bean with E defined in class path, unsatisfied dependency expressed through property fuel. Again it is saying set this property or remove dependency checking for this bean. Okay, so fuel object it is saying mandatory. You need to inject fuel mandatory here. So then it is mandatory that you need to pass property name fuel and the type is secondary type. Secondary types we inject using reference. Secondary types we inject using reference. What is the fuel reference here? Decide. You need to pass it here. Now this object, whatever fuel object is created, that will be injected into engine. So now comfortably fuel object created, engine object created, car object also created. Consider car class is having two dependencies, private string car name. This is primitive. I will have one more property, private engine engine. One is primitive and one is secondary type. Now I'll have two setter methods here, set car name and set engine. Okay, one primitive I have and one secondary also I have here. Whereas in engine I have only secondary type. Whereas in fuel I have only primitive type. Fuel is having primitive type, engine is having secondary type, car is having both primitive and secondary. Both I have. So when I have primitive, I used simple. Fuel have only primitive fuel name only. So I use simple. Engine is having fuel dependency. So I use object. It's a secondary type. Car is having both car name and engine object. One primitive, one secondary type I have. In such scenario, what you need to use dependency check to all. When you put dependency check all, then it is mandatory to inject both primitive and secondaries. If you miss even one thing also, it will not create object. Run it and see. Car object also created, but still it is throwing exception. Your application will be terminated by saying unsatisfied dependency injection into car class. What it is saying is unsatisfied dependency expressed through the bean property car name. Set this property or remove it. Why it is not saying the other one as well? That one it will say next. First to pass car name. So it is saying car name is mandatory. Fine. I'll pass the car name. Property car name value XUV. So car name I have given. Now when I run it, it said car name only mandatory to us. Again it is throwing error by saying engine object also has a mandatory. It is saying here engine also mandatory. Set this property value or disable it. So both are mandatory when you configure dependency check to all. If it is simple, then it will create only car name would be enough, as this is primitive. If you have only secondary type, objects would be enough. But when you have both, you need to mention all. Then it is compulsory you should pass both the values. So my car is having car name dependency, as well as I have engine object also has a dependency here. So configure both engine and the engine reference. Now run it. Now comfortably fuel engine car objects created and application running fine. Okay, so this is how you can put dependency check when you want to restrict user or restrict to developer, or when you want to make developer by saying that all these properties as mandatory. You might ask a question here, as I am a developer and I know what all properties need to injected during the development time, why I should configure myself here as a dependency check? As you are the developer, you know what are all the mandatory things. Why you need to put the dependency check and you need to pass them here? Okay, maybe think this scenario, right? You don't configure this dependency check here. You have a car object, and as you know, these two are mandatory, car name and engine. You are passing it. Okay, so during application maintenance, there is a change request came and a new developer came here to do the changes, and somehow he removed it. And during the compilation time, he might not see any issues. So once after building, he might push code to production. Consider there is no testing case. So there he will see many errors as the mandatory property is not passed. Okay, so this is one scenario, right? If you configure dependency check, so though you are done with your development and it is passed, maybe in future if somebody try to remove it, maybe somebody try to remove it, and during the build time or during execution of unit test cases, at least while your IOC container starting, right, it will show the error that car name you missed. You must need to pass the car name, otherwise car will not be instantiated. So if it give that exception, okay, then they will realize that this is mandatory, that they need to pass it. Okay, this is one scenario. Consider you are implementing some design pattern. The second scenario, design patterns or reusable classes. Okay, for your organization, you are implementing some POC kind of implementation or reusable components are you implementing for your company. Okay, so there are some JDBC connection pool or JDBC template classes you are creating. Okay, template means what? Some reusable methods you implemented for cloud operations. Okay, so there the template classes are required this driver name, URL, password, right? All these are as mandatory properties. Okay, being an architect, you want to make sure whoever use that class, they must need to pass all these properties. So during your JDBC template design, if you configure that dependency check for your template class by saying all are mandatory, whoever is going to use your design pattern or whatever template that you have implemented, they must need to understand that, okay, he mentioned that all these are mandatory, so I should pass compulsory all the properties which are there in the template class. Otherwise the template class is not useful. Okay, so you might have these two scenarios when you need to put this, when really all the properties are mandatory. If somebody try to modify them, if you don't want to allow modify, or if you don't want to allow delete it, then you need to configure this dependency check. Okay, and when you want to design some kind of templates for reusability to others and your template class really needs some mandatory properties, then also you can put this dependency check. Okay, so dependency check we can achieve using this XML approach. Okay, and you can achieve this by using annotation approach. Okay, so annotation approach is recommended. As I said, if you design a template, If you design a template, you are not going to provide any XML to other team members. You will provide simply your jar file. In your jar file, you will have your class only. Inside class only, if you want to configure this instead of configuring here, you can do that using annotation. Okay, so for fuel class, I'll remove this here. Okay, just let me comment it. For fuel class, I'll remove this dependency check here, and I'll do it through annotation. Okay, go to fuel class, on top of your setter method, put at the rate required. Put at the rate required. Okay, so this required is similar like your dependency check only. So required means mandatory. In other words, required definition mandatory. Required means mandatory, right? So when I configure required, it is trying to saying set field name is mandatory. Okay, it is mandatory. Now when you try to create this field object, when you try to create field object without this property, it should throw error. It should throw error. Try to run it. Will it throw error or not? See. So fuel object, engine object, car object comfortably creating without throwing any error. Though I configured here required. Why? Because as I said in previous session, annotations need to be activated. This annotation need to be activated here. The annotation need to be activated. There are two approaches I said, right? Context colon annotation config. There is a schema name called context colon annotation hyphen config. If you configure this, it will activate your annotations. It will activate your annotations. This is one way. Otherwise, there is a post processor class. The class name is required annotation bean post processor. This class, just you need to configure this class in your XML file just to activate your annotation. Bean class. This bean class for what? For activating annotations. For activating required annotation. Okay, only required annotation will be activated. To activate at the rate required annotation. So your required annotation will be activated now. Just you configure this bean class, required annotation bean post processor. There are many bean post processor classes they given for activating annotations. Okay, for AutoWait they given AutoWire annotation bean post processor, required annotation bean post processor, common annotation bean post processor. Common annotation also we used for lifecycle activating init and destroy method. Post construct pre-destroy annotations we used. Okay, anyway, you need not to worry about these classes. Instead, you configure context colon annotation config. It will activate all the annotations. You need not to worry about this post processor classes. Now run it. I activated required. Now it is throwing error while after creation of fuel object, it is saying bean creation exception. Earlier unsatisfied dependency exception we see. Now it is saying bean creation exception. Error creating bean with fuel, and it is saying property field name is required. It is saying property field name is required. Earlier it used to say remove that from there or keep it by passing value, something like that. Now it is saying field name is required. It is required, it is saying. Just if it is required, you need to pass it. We used at the rate required here. So you must need to pass it. Whatever field name you should pass. Without passing field name, it won't allow you to create object. Done. Now field object created, engine created, car created. Same thing wherever you want, right? In engine class also, if you need for this setter method, even it is secondary type also. When you go with this annotation, right? For primitives or secondaries, same annotation required. That's it. Okay. And if you want to use it for car class for both these properties, required, required. On top of your setter methods, put required, required. But you need not to do these configurations in XML file. This dependency check annotations you can remove here. We can remove them here. Dependency type objects, dependency type all, and dependency type simple. You can remove here. As usual, it will work. Okay. So that is the benefit with this required annotation as well. Okay. Do you have any doubts? So we discussed here today. One is depends on when one class object creation should be happened after another class. It's dependency class objects creation. We use depends on. And when you want to make mandatory, your mandatory by calling your setter methods. If you want to pass the properties of your class, right? Or whatever dependencies you have. When you want to make your dependencies as mandatory, we go with this dependency check, or else we can use annotation as well. Annotation need to configure on top of setter method. Okay, are we clear? Yeah. So if we are clear,